Welcome to the final panel for Growth Week 2013. I think we discussed lots of interesting ideas for growth in the last 3 days, and we conclude with perhaps the most interesting, but definitely the most challenging, which is how to create economic growth at the very bottom of the income distribution, the poorest people in the poorest countries. Tonight we have Abhijit Banerjee, who's a professor of economics at MIT, and Robin Burgess, professor of economics at LSE, who will discuss evidence on the Ultrapoor program, which is an innovative poverty reduction program created first by BRAC in Bangladesh. And we're very happy to have here Mushtaque Chowdhury, who's the vice chair of BRAC itself. And finally, Dean Karlan, who's a professor of economics at Yale, who will also discuss evidence from Ultrapoor programs in other countries. So welcome to the speakers, welcome everybody, and enjoy the session.
Okay, welcome everybody. So I'm going to start with just a few slides, hopefully, on an evaluation which is done with this long list of people here, including Oriana, but also two members of the research team at BRAC. But I wanted to start by just saying a few words about how this project got started. So the project got started because I knew Mushtaque Chowdhury, who's here. And that was because I had a Thai student who was studying informal education in Bangladesh. So I went out there and they said, you should visit this program that we have in the northwest of the country. So I went up there, and from lists, and so the first observation was the BRAC offices were incredibly well organized. They had a list of everybody. So I selected a few people, and this is 2006. So the piloting, some of the women I visited were 4 years into the program and some were 2 years in. And one thing that was sort of striking about when I visited, and obviously it was done through a translator, and everybody in the village showed up and took a look, was there was something that was strikingly different about the women in terms of not only the fact, so the key question I kept asking was, have you done anything in areas outside the asset that was transferred to you? So in many of these villages, one key thing that people want is paddy land. So have you bought paddy land? Have you... And in a few cases, not large amounts, they had already diversified into some other asset. This is particularly the ones after 4 years. So that made me think, well, A, they seem to have a very different attitude, around the headman and so on. They seem to be much more confident. But it was clear that they were still operating the asset that had been transferred. And in some of the cases, they'd moved into some other asset. For example, paddy land or buying a cycle rickshaw and renting it out. So that made me think, well, maybe there was something here that was different in terms of the impact that's having on these women, in particular that they were sort of changing the occupations that they were doing. Because primarily these women, at the point that they receive the program, are agricultural laborers or domestic servants. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing was, the reason that I was personally interested in this is that for a long time I'd been working on some work with Dave Donaldson at MIT on railroads and famines in India. And it was clear when you read all the reports, the Famine Commission reports and so forth, that many of the victims were landless laborers. So the sort of bottom tier society in India has always been landless laborers, and the reason is fairly simple. They're uneducated, so they don't really have access to non-agricultural stuff, and then the type of employment they have is incredibly seasonal, right? So their sort of main income is sort of the wage over the price, and if there's bad weather, such as the case famines, the wage gets pressed down and the price gets pushed up. So in that case, so I've been sort of interested in this group and whether they could ever be reached, and that sort of comes to the third point I want to make, is this ultra-poor idea. So these people, as we see, are not the poor, they're the ultra-poor. So they're basically defined in a variety of ways, apart from very low incomes. Primarily things to do with assetlessness. They just don't have any assets, they're uneducated. So they don't really have any opportunities except for this rather itinerant wage labor market. Okay, so they may operate some small amounts of poultry, but they're really in a very tenuous position. And so later on I was doing some other work on weather in India, and again you saw this pattern where weather, even in the period after independence, seemed to be associated with higher mortality. And even though we couldn't break out who was dying, and this was only in rural areas, my suspicion was again that in India today and in Bangladesh and in many of the South Asian countries, you still have this very, very bottom tier of ultra-poor women. And those people will be defined differently, say, in Africa, but they'll have very similar characteristics, primarily that they lack capital and they lack skills. Right, so these are people who are short of both. And the program that we're all going to be talking about today basically is innovative in the sense, in sort of three respects. The first is it's kind of like a big push program. So it's actually gives large transfers. So in the program that I'll be talking about, it's mainly, they get a choice of what little business they want to run, and they mainly chose livestock, primarily cows. They may make different choices elsewhere. But a cow's worth a lot of money. So the transfer, just the livestock asset transfer, is about $140 per annum. And then there's an additional about $140, $150, which is all the visits they receive from BRAC officers, the livestock training they receive in the classroom, the livestock specialists that come 1 to 2 months. So imagine these women, that I saw, the ones that hadn't received the program, who are living in sort of ramshackle huts, children not in school, no assets, illiterate. Suddenly they receive all this attention. They receive an asset, they receive the necessary training to operate that asset. So the sort of first characteristic of the program, which I think is different, if you want to put it that way, is it's big. It's a big push to kind of give them a lot of capital and skills. The second aspect is it's given together. So you get the capital and the skills together. Now we're looking at a combined, these things come together, but other programs are trying to separate those. And the third characteristic, which I think is incredibly important, is that they receive this assistance for a while. So it's not like they get some classroom training and then people say, okay, see you later, and hope that they'll go on and take new occupations. They're visited weekly. Their savings books are checked. There's a lot of attention placed upon them. And then after 2 years, they're sort of said, okay, that's your lot, and they're encouraged to join microfinance groups. So when I talk about difficult to reach, these are people who, even though microfinance is very well, there's a lot of microfinance in Bangladesh. I think pretty much every village has some operator. They were not demanding any microfinance because they saw no use for capital. Because they were basically working in these wage labor markets, they were not investing. Primarily, some of them were operating some livestock. So I think this intensity of treatment is incredibly important. It's very different, and it's like you're receiving a lot of attention over a sustained period. And the question is, does that, and this is sort of, again, what I think is very different, does it actually allow you to sort of change occupation, or at least move into some different lines of business? And that, again, is very different from most of the kind of training or finance capital interventions you see. So those are mainly just focused on people who are not, who are not going to shift occupation. And if you think about the overall process of development of people shifting occupations, this is something which is sort of like trying to take the people essentially at the bottom, very, very bottom part of the income distribution in the village and move them a little way up. And I'm going to come at the end to look at how far they've moved up relative to sort of the middle and top of the income distribution in these villages. So primarily, I think what is interesting is, I mean, this is fairly evident what the questions are. Starting with low capital skills, we don't know that if you push on both those fronts, you're going to get some effect on labor supply. And finally, we don't know whether, if even people do make an attempt to change occupation, that's going to put them on a different trajectory than had they not received those capital and skills. So the way I see it is that we obviously, anybody who visits any pretty much any community on Earth sees some correlation between capital and skills and things like income. But the problem is it's not clear that the lack of capital and skills are a cause of poverty, right? So what we're trying to do here is do a big randomized intervention which will give us some answer to that question, which is obviously a very important question because, as I keep saying, this group is incredibly difficult to reach. There's very few interventions I can think of that actually kind of permanently change their lives. There's things that can lift them for a bit. And, there's lots of, behavioral and other norm-type reasons as to why people might not want to shift occupation. For example, they may not feel that they're qualified. They may feel it's socially unacceptable. So what I found exciting going into the project is, firstly, that BRAC very kindly allowed us to live off a percentage, basically the valuation percentage of the program. So this was very expensive. The valuation I'm talking about cost about just over £1 million. And the reason it cost so much is we did the randomization across communities. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to look not just at the effect of the women who received the program, but also at the effect of the people who are in other parts of the income distribution. And the second reason we want to do that is we want to look at the general equilibrium effect. So, for example, if these women, having received the program, are now withdrawing their labor from the agricultural labor markets, well, then maybe the other poor who are still working in them will receive a higher wage. You'd expect effects on prices, the things they produce, meat, eggs, and so forth. So basically, what you have is a kind of a whole set of questions, which I think are sort of fundamental, and at least when I was beginning the project, sort of unresolved in my head what we'd actually see. So the first thing is you begin to look at the literature on whether asset transfers affect wealth. You think that's pretty obvious. You're being given something that's worth a lot of money, it should do. But what you see a lot of, particularly in the livestock sector, is things die. They don't know how to operate these things. They don't know how to feed it. To me, it would seem pretty daunting if somebody gave me a cow tomorrow, what I would do with that cow. Right? I'd have no clue. I'd hope to find a field, give it some grass. I had no clue how much water it needs, what the kinds of diseases and so forth. So it's not like these businesses. And I should be clear that they were given a menu of choices that included things like running a shop, renting land to grow vegetables, poultry rearing, and then various types of livestock, which I'll show you more about, various poultry, goat, cow combinations. And what most of them chose, about 90%, was the livestock thing. And I think that's partly because this is a fairly common business. It's a business they can see the richer members of these communities operating with some success. And so what's going to be interesting here is can this joint capital skill intervention push them into those occupations which were not exclusively, but were really mainly to preserve the non-poor women in these villages. So the first sort of question is, does this transfer even begin to translate into a wealth increase? It might not, for some obvious reasons. The other thing is, in a very simple model of labor supply, if you basically win the lottery, so these people are getting about 10 times the value of this asset, this cow, is about 10 times their household wealth. They're assetless people, so you're starting from a very low base. In that event, one option you might take is say, well, I have no clue what to do with this thing, so I'm going to sell it, and then I might, for example, use the money for something which is perhaps even more productive than you might consume it. You might put it in a bank and earn interest. And so I think there's a whole set of questions as to why they would even change occupation, behavior and other types of reasons. So what we want to do is, and then there's, the sort of most hopeful, that they would actually use this asset to start a new business and increase labor supply. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of the talk, given that we don't have a huge amount of time, is try to give you, I hope, a precise sense of what this program looked like, and then I'll run through the results in terms of what happened to these women, and then finally I'll compare these women to other people in the middle of the income distribution at baseline. So basically, how much did they close the gap on in various characteristics of these women? But I wanted to just list out the selection procedure for finding the ultra-poor women. So what basically happens, and I've only observed this once, is that the population of a village gets together and they draw some boxes in the dirt, and they've been given some basic information from a census of the community. So the community here is something a little smaller than a village. It's what you might call a hamlet or a spot or a community. I'm going to call it a community. And then basically you have the very poorest, the sort of middle, or next poorest, middle, and rich. And essentially the characteristics of those at the bottom are the ones I've already pointed out. They're landless, they're assetless, they're uneducated, and so forth. And in the middle, they may have a small amount of land. At the top, they will, for example, own some land and perhaps run a business, perhaps even employ some people. So what then, to standardize selection, BRAC comes in, and they're already selecting the poorest part of the country and the poorest communities there. And then they go through and, for example, if you're borrowing from an MFI or getting anti-poverty program relief, then you're excluded. And then there's you have to then satisfy 3 out of 5 inclusions, which are to do with assetless land ownership and so forth. And what you end up with is, so there's a sort of standardization of selection, is you end up with, in effect, a group that satisfies those criteria and is treated, that gets the cow and the training, and then a group that is that is deemed as poor by the community but doesn't satisfy the criteria. Then you have a middle, and then you have the rich. And this is just to give you a sense of the sort of labor supply of the poor, the near poor, and the middle class. And what's really striking is obviously that there's a huge increase in self-employment as you move up the income distribution, and a big decrease in wage labor. So basically the people in the middle and the rich don't do wage labor. They don't work for others. So this is going to be critical, because when we look at other characteristics, it sort of lines up. So the people who are the targeted poor, the ultra poor, are much more female-headed, because that's one of the selection criteria, and much less literate. So this sort of lines up with this idea that they have lower per capita expenditure, they're more food insecure, and not surprisingly, they have a lower share of households with livestock. And they're also basically landless. So in terms of the evaluation strategy, what we're going to do is we're going to select 20 branches of BRAC as treatment, 20 as control, and we are going to basically select the communities in each of those areas, and we stratify by sub-district. So essentially what we're going to have is a whole bunch of communities that are treated, a whole bunch that are control, and we're going to do a baseline in 2007, one follow-up in 2009, and a second follow-up in 2011. In fact, we agreed today that we're going to also continue tracking into 2013. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to just go through the main results. So the main results are that, surprising to us, there was most of the ultra-poor maintain or increase the asset stock. And we'll come to that. There is some people who are losing their assets. But the sort of critical thing in terms of occupation is this huge increase that you see in self-employment. Okay, so remember that they're doing very little of that. Now they're doing a whole lot more, and they're doing much less wage labor. And one thing that's also striking is that they spread their labor now, not surprisingly, because obviously if you're taking care of livestock, you have to take care of it more or less daily across the year. And so you get this much more stable, less seasonal employment than you do when they were dependent on wage labor. So the sort of headline result, as a result of sort of shifting their labor supply, and one thing just to notice here is that this obviously is much bigger than this. So overall, labor supply increases a great deal. So one of the kind of key results of these women are working much more, which is not what you'd predict if you win the lottery. If you win the lottery, what you'd predict is you would consume more leisure. So they're working much more, they're spreading that labor across time more evenly, and as a result, we're seeing much, much higher earnings. And very importantly, we're seeing even there's a step change. This is the 2-year effect, and this is the 4-year effect. And then here you see per capita expenditure, again, big effects, and increasing over time. So this comes to this sort of trajectory point. It looks like rather than them pulling out of the thing over time, they're actually crowding into creating more value from their asset. This is savings, and this is land, which is obviously from an incredibly low base, but they're beginning to rent and own more land. And that again comes to this point which I raised at the beginning as to whether they are on some sort of trajectory out of poverty. And for its worth, you also see higher life satisfaction. So to end, I mean, I don't want to pretend that these effects are uniformly positive. So if you look, for example, at income, this is the 4-year effect, and that's the 2-year effect. So here it looks like they are struggling, and perhaps these are the people who are losing their assets for the various reasons. We need to look at that. But there's not a sort of uniformly even pattern. But clearly the gains are being felt more keenly at those at the top end of the thing. There's a similar pattern for consumption. So to finish, what we're going to do now is just look at the difference between the people in the middle. So this is sort of, are we making a middle class type of question? Remembering what middle class here means, still people basically doing agriculture. It's not the middle class of Dhaka. And what you see here, which is really striking, is that to begin with, so this is the gap where you're sort of taking the middle minus the ultra-poor. You see, not surprisingly, the middle are working much more in self-employment. But after 4 years, so we're looking at the 4-year thing, and one very important point is after 4 years, for the whole period between 2 and 4 years, they received no assistance from BRAC. And they are now working more than the middle class in self-employment. They're reducing significantly, I guess in an increasing way, the hours spent in wage labor. Again, they're working, the middle were working many more days across a year because these people have sort of working about 150 days of seasonal, both in the domestic labor and the agricultural labor both sees about 150 days a year. And that they're getting very close. They're spreading their labor across. And this is incredibly important. So initially the middle are much more productive, but actually after 4 years, the ultra-poor, these people amongst most disadvantaged people, are actually being more productive per year, per hour, or basically very similar productivity levels to the middle class. So that's a very striking finding, that the change in land is much less marked, and again, very significant improvements in terms of food security, which tries to capture whether you can have a sufficient number of meals in the day. They're again getting very close to the middle class's position on food security, and you see effects on for example, infant mortality and so forth. So I think, just to conclude, I think the 2 points I'd like you to leave you with is, firstly, it's clear that this type of program, I'm not saying which elements of it, have an incredibly big effect at some expense. You do some cost benefit to show that it's much more effective than if you gave them cash transfer and you put it into a bank account. So that's the first thing. It has a big effect. But I think what's much more exciting comes to the first question that I asked when I went to these villages. It does look like these people are beginning to resemble, both in the assets that they're buying and operating, which are not necessarily those that are transferred by the program, the middle class. They're certainly not reaching, for example, land ownership of the middle class, but they're beginning to creep up. And very importantly, for that group that was very close to them but was not selected into the program, called them the near poor, the other poor, they've completely leapfrogged them. They've leapfrogged that group, and they're now, somewhere between that group and the middle class. And to achieve that over a 4-year period is, quite I think, a result worth publicizing. Thank you very much.
So one advantage of having collaborated with someone for many years is that I could predict exactly what would happen, which is that Robin will explain everything that I needed to. So I actually budgeted for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do the last bit of what Robin did, mostly over again for a very, very similar program. So the program that I'm going to talk about is the program run by Bandhan, which is very much a BRAC emulator. So very influenced by BRAC. Wonderful organization also, based in West Bengal. This program is very much acknowledgedly influenced by BRAC. In fact, at the beginning of the program, there was a team from BRAC which was at Bandhan training them on how to run an Ultrapoor program. So I was there at one of those meetings. So it was very much, the imprint of BRAC was very clear on the program. So in that sense, these are very similar programs, run in very similar places. This is run in Murshidabad. Murshidabad is on the border with Bangladesh. So it's in the east of West Bengal, the central east of West Bengal. It has a common border with Bangladesh, and is also, I think, in terms of, in the particular areas we were, also was more, I think, in terms of religious distribution, more similar to Bangladesh than many other parts of West Bengal. So this is very, very similar area, and the program is very similar. Fortunately, we get very similar results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just spend a little bit more time on the results. I think you saw them, but they flew past you, perhaps, or they flew past me. Maybe you read faster than me. So I'm going to just spend a little bit more time on the results of this program, and assume that you have mostly understood what's interesting here. What's interesting here, as Robin keeps emphasizing, is that it's not interesting, or maybe it's interesting to say that when you give people money, they get richer. What's interesting is to say that when you give people money, they remain richer after you stop giving them money. And I think that's the question that was sort of central to this exercise. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go through some of the results. This is sort of a description of the program. You can do many. You have many choices, as in the BRAC program, and mostly people did take livestock. So it was again very similar. Perhaps a slightly higher proportion took non-livestock occupations. Selling things. I think the big alternative was either some grinding rice or selling, just buying things in the city and selling them, just going from house to house selling saris, for example. So that was a slightly higher proportion, but mostly all of these things were very similar. There was intense kind of monitoring from Bandhan staff. So the costs were, again, quite similar to the costs in BRAC, slightly lower, if my memory serves me. It's there, I think you said about $300 per person. I think our costs were about $220 or $30. But the order of magnitude very similar, and about equally split between the cost of the cow and the cost of the training and the sort of the general monitoring. The program started in May 2007. The first end line is in March 2009, roughly, and the second end line is in July 2010. So something of the order of the average distance is 3.5 years, 1.5 years between the first when people got the assets and the first survey, and 3.5 years between when they got the assets in the second survey. So again, very similar orders of magnitude. I think you had 2 years and 4 years. So So one interesting fact, which is troubling here, is this one, which almost killed us, because lots of people, you think if you give away money, people will take it. And the answer is no. Lots of people didn't. 156 people refused basically a gift of money, because maybe you don't want to rear a cow, but cows are very saleable. You could have sold it. They just refused it. The reason was that there was a rumor spread. Not clear who spread the rumor, whose interest it was to spread the rumor, but the rumor was very much there that Bandhan was a Christian organization, I think, and it was a way to convert people to Christianity, and that took care of that. So people were. What intrigues me in all of that is the fact that people actually thought that if they took a cow from Bandhan, they would have to convert to Christianity. I mean, it seems that's the part I find least plausible. I mean, suppose I would have just taken the cow, even if I believed they were Christian missionaries, I would have taken the cow and then, sold it, and what could they do? But nonetheless, so this is so as I said, a slightly higher proportion of non-farm, but only slightly. So it's 12% instead of you said less than 10. So only slightly. I'll skip all this. So what happened? So this is the orange is treatment, meaning people who were chosen to get the program. So one of the things you have to do in this, that's the only thing that's perhaps complicated in what I'm going to say, or slightly complicated, is imagine that I offer a program to 400 people and only 300 take it, or 450 people and 300 take it. Then basically what I can't do is I can't use the people who took the program as the people who I selected randomly to get the program. That's not allowed. Why? Because those people are not like the people who were offered the program. Some people, they are probably more conservative, they're more religious, and they're different from the people who were initially offered the program. There are selected subset of that group. So you cannot compare those people with the people who were eventually not given the program. So what we have to do, therefore, is act as if all the people who were offered the program had all kind of taken the program, or at least were treated evenly with each other. So everybody who's offered the program is in our treatment group, and everybody who was randomly chosen not to give them the program is in our control group. So that means that the treatment actually only comes off 2/3 of that population. The other 1/3 of the population didn't take the program, and therefore every effect you see is scaled down. So everybody taking it, it would be about half as big again. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. That basically the effects are substantial, and the effect that really counts, which is the effect on the person who got it, was bigger than that. And that's something to keep in mind when you look at the data. So with that, I think we can. So what happened was, you see basically a more or less persistent increase in per capita monthly average expenditure. So it's 14% in the brown is always, or gray is always control, and orange is always treatment. On the left is N line 1, on the right. That's after a year and a half. On the right is N line 2, which is after 3.5 years. And you basically have different measures of consumption. And the thing to to note this really, other than the fact that it went up and it went up significantly, the increases were somewhat smaller in the second N line, but one of the things that's striking about that is that largely because the control actually caught up. So one of the things that's happening here is there is a large government program that's launched in the middle of all this, which is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee. It's world's largest kind of anti-poverty program, and that was launched in the middle of it. So I think the participation in that program created some force for convergence. So people who actually had a cow stayed home and took care of the cow, and the people who didn't get the cow did actually go and work for this program. So you see some force of convergence. And I think the reason why the effects are smaller is mostly because of that. As you see, both of them are higher in the second N line than in the first N line, but the increase is bigger for the control group, which is, I think, a result of this other program. And that's an occupational hazard of anybody doing program evaluation. Other things happen. So one of the things other thing to emphasize is that you see basically one thing that really does change between the first and second N line, and that's durables. So in the first N line, the money goes into like food. A lot of the extra money goes into food and other things that are sort of more essentials, if you like. And in the second N line, you start to see people buying durables. So they're buying, and durables means they're buying like very rarely televisions, but like a pressure cooker, pots, stoves, all kinds of things. So they're buying durables, and that seems to be one of the things that happens after the first thing people do is they accumulate some. You get increase in food security first, and then after food security, you see people moving towards these other assets, and you see that pattern here. And that this is just breaking that down, and you see basically all kind of food items. So this is what food security. So food security goes up substantially in the sense that adult skipped meals goes down significantly. So it's much less likely that the adults skip meals, much less likely that the children skip meals. So you do see effects on food security, like I think the result that Robin reported. People actually continue to buy animals. So you see people so this is not the number of assets you have, it's the number of assets you buy. So in addition, people acquire assets. So it's not that they eat up the cows, I have no doubt they do, but they replace them. So on balance, you get more cows. So people are actually acquiring assets. The stock goes up, therefore, by a lot. This is the stock. So the previous one was how many cows are you buying? They buy more cows. And this one, therefore, they have a lot more cows and birds and sheep and goats and pigs. So they have a lot more animals, and that and you see that both it's significant in both. It's somewhat smaller again in the second N line. This is other sources of income. I'm going to skip this. What's striking here? I think this I find striking. So is that if you look at business income, so business income is now defined to be not, unlike in some sense Robin used the word, maybe the word business, I think, or self-employment income. So this is not income from cows. This is or livestock. This is something else. They're really starting what we would call a business. So in other words, they were always partly self-employed. But now what they're doing is they're actually running a little shop, or they're selling things, or buying fruits and taking them to a different village to sell, or they're something else. So they're starting a non-agricultural business. And that's something that doesn't happen in the first end line, but shoots up in the second end line. And you start to see people really changing their occupational patterns, not at the beginning. The first reaction seems to be that they secure themselves. The second reaction seems to be that they're now doing more different things. That's consistent with another thing, which is that if you look at this is where I think the results are different from the results that Robin showed. You see, in treatment, people are always working more. You have the same? Maybe I misinterpreted the slide. So people are working more. Here we don't break up labor supply, but I think elsewhere we've seen that people are working more, and people who are working more are now in the second end line. They're shifting some of that labor towards other things. They're working in their outside businesses. So that's, I think that's. So the other fact that's interesting is that they are starting to borrow. So I think one of the things that's happening is that they are now eligible for microcredit. This is I'll be done. I don't have much to say. Robin already said most things I had to say. So one of the things that happens is that the formal, quasi-formal borrowing, that's the column on the right, you see no difference whatsoever in the first end line. So at the first end line, they're still borrowing from their friends, relatives, neighbors. By the second end line, they're participating in financial markets. They're borrowing from Bandhan. And that's also very large effect and significant. So you see a big change in that. That's very clear. Bandhan loans goes up a lot. They have the amount of formal savings doesn't really change. It changes. It is actually not a small effect, 20% higher, but they're not actually, it's not statistically significant. What is statistically significant is the ownership of all assets. So they have more livestock, but also more of every other asset. Household durables, they have, every asset they have more. So they are actually moving on a path towards accumulating lots of assets. In other words, as Robin emphasized, and appropriately, I think that the way to think about these results, what's interesting about these results, is the fact that these people, this one push seems to be putting them on the same trajectory that most other poor people seem to be on, which is, I think if you look at the multiple impact evaluations of microcredit, for example, including one we did, one Dean did, you have the same pattern, which is that when people get microcredit, the main use of microcredit is to actually acquire household assets, not so much business assets. And that's the dominant fact that also shows up here, is that you see the trajectory into getting household assets. That's it. I think we see some changes in female autonomy, but it's in the first end line, and those get bigger in the second end line. It's still, I would have thought, given that these women are the primary earners in these families, these effects are small, but part of the reason is that precisely because they're primary earners, they already have a fair amount of autonomy. So that's perhaps health. To the extent that we measure it, we don't see huge amount of improvement in what we can actually directly observe, which is the number of days you couldn't work. That's one thing which seems objective. Everything else, unfortunately, is self-reported. So all the two measures that where we do see a positive improvement are self-reported measures of health. Where we do see an improvement, we don't see, when we ask them, did you miss work because of ill health, that doesn't seem to change. So that could be because, it's a matter of they get better faster, but they get sick just as often because the inherent disease profile has not changed, but we don't see. Finally, one thing that we find that Robin and Oriana and others don't find is this hedonic treadmill. So people in the first end line are happy. They got this, their welfare, their self-reported well-being is higher. But then, some reason that completely goes away. So the one thing, and I think that's not an unknown fact in many other contexts, that's called the hedonic treadmill. People get used to their better state, and at that point they start complaining once again. Now what's striking is they don't find that. That's the one place where the results are different, and I'm going to, I'll stop here and just, so I think what's striking about nevertheless, I think mostly these results are very consistent with what Robin reported, and I think what is, interesting when you report this to economists is they say that, of course, this is what's supposed to happen. In fact, Oriana presented and that was the exact reaction, except that if you had to, ask people 5 years ago, I'm going to take some of these desperately poor people and I'm going to give them some assets, I think the median prediction would have been, these people, how did they get to be desperately poor? They must be irresponsible people of some kind, and so they must, if you give them assets, they'll just waste them. So I feel that you can, since people always know the truth ex post, it's hard to convince people, but I still think that I was maybe pleasantly surprised by these results, and I hope it sort of creates more faith in our ability to do things for the poor. Thank you.
Good evening. It's really a great pleasure to be at LSE, and I thank Robin and Oriana and all colleagues at IGC for inviting me to this very important meeting in this event. It's really very nice to be back to LSE because there is some nostalgia there. I spent a year at LSE a long time ago. But the situation that was there at that time has changed enormously. At that time, there was no Sheikh Zayed's auditorium, for example, and the department which I was part of has now been disbanded. So there is no demography department anymore in LSE. But there is a population studies program, I think, which is still there, I suppose. So it's really nice to be back here, and I thank you, the organizers, for this opportunity. Much has also changed over the years in the world, and also in Bangladesh. As you know, that much has been written about Bangladesh and said about Bangladesh over the last several years. We still remember the very unjust and cruel comment that we heard at the birth of our country, which is to say that it was going to be a basket case, an international basket case. But fortunately, we can say that basket case is no more there, that there is no such thing as basket case in Bangladesh. And according to many people, many observers, Bangladesh has actually become a basket of innovations. So we are very happy about that. I have been personally doing some research recently, particularly on the health side. and how the country has made progress over the years. And we are seeing a kind of a paradox. Paradox in the sense that we are seeing a lot of improvements in some areas, but in some others we are seeing some stagnancy or some kind of mixed results. On the one hand, for example, we have seen that the mortality levels, both the infant, child, and maternal mortality, has gone down tremendously over the years. Fertility also, at the time of the birth of Bangladesh had a total fertility rate of 7, which has now reduced to 2.3, which is just above the replacement level. So Bangladesh has done quite well in the fight or in the struggle to control its population. In terms of life expectancy, the life expectancy in Bangladesh is now about 69. But more importantly is the gender difference. Until the 1980s, late 1980s, Bangladesh was one of the 3 countries in the world where women lived a shorter life. But over the years, over the last 20 years or so, this has been corrected. Now women live 1.5 years more than the men. In terms of schooling, for example, the net enrollment rate at primary has crossed 90%. And the gender difference between boys and girls in school has disappeared. In fact, there are more girls in school than boys. And if we look at these changes from an equity dimension perspective, we see that the people, the poor, the women, and other disadvantaged groups, they have benefited more from these changes. On the other hand, the progress has been little mixed. For example, in terms of reducing malnutrition, particularly stunting, and also there has been some mixed progress in reducing income poverty. There has been reduction in the headcount poverty, but the Gini coefficient has stubbornly been very static over the years. It hasn't changed much. We all know that the poor are very heterogeneous, and over the years we have seen that the middle poor and the upper poor, they have benefited more, but not the lowest 15% of the population. And when I talk about this 15%, they are not those who live under $1.25, but those who live with 50 cents or 60 cents a day. And these are the things that precisely Robin and Abhijit have been talking about, these bottom 15%. And we call them the ultra-poor. BRAC has been in developments over the last 4 decades, and it was started in Bangladesh, as you know, and from 2002 BRAC became international. BRAC is now working in 10 countries and reaching about 140 million population. And BRAC, as you probably know, many of you know that BRAC runs large programs. BRAC is probably the largest NGO in the world, at least in some measures. So, for example, the microfinance program reaches over 5 million borrowers. The education program, the schools program, BRAC runs the largest private sector education program in the world, with 1.1 million children enrolled in BRAC schools. And health program and women's empowerment and agriculture, these are all large programs that are catering to the needs of the population. And a very distinguishing feature of BRAC is that we consider BRAC as a learning organization, in the sense that we learn from our failures and we learn from our successes, and we try to incorporate those learnings into our programs as we move along. Our main goal is obviously poverty reduction, and in the late 1980s we found that most of our programs were not reaching the ultra-poor. And the first thing that we did was to work with the government. The government at that time was implementing a program called the vulnerable group feeding program, which was a dole. And we asked the government that why not introduce some training, skills training into it, so that when the dole is stopped, these women can still continue earning an income. And that was the first time that we started thinking and working on the ultra-poor. But the dedicated ultra-poor program was not started until 2002. And we have heard about that today from the two previous presentations. Through this TUP program, Targeting Ultra-Poor program, we have so far reached over 400,000 households in Bangladesh. And from our research, we have seen that more than 90% of them have actually graduated out of ultra-poverty, and they have remained in an upward economic trajectory, as has been shown by Robin, for example, even after 4 years of when the program ended. Globally, unfortunately, there hasn't been much concern or thinking or experimentation about how to reach and what to do about the ultra-poor. Now, considering the TUP as one of the response to ultra-poverty reduction, some sort of development partners such as the CGAP and the Ford Foundation, they started replicating this program in other countries. So now, for example, probably in about 12 countries, this program is being replicated. And in most cases, it has worked quite well. We have seen it is working in Bangladesh and also in West Bengal. And also, there are other countries, for example, in Ethiopia or, for example, in Afghanistan, it seems to be working well. But unfortunately, it hasn't been as successful everywhere. In our opinion, and those of the researchers who have studied those programs, the reasons for it of not working well is more related to the context in which those programs are implemented, but not necessarily a fault in the design or the model. I'm not going further into those. Rather, I wish to talk about some of the critical factors that we think are important determinants for success of a program like the TUP. First, we have to remember that it is a package. It is a package of several things. For example, the asset transfer, the skills training, the subsistence allowance to offset the loss in wages, the savings, health, education, and so on. Thirdly, the provision of moral and psychological support, as we have seen in the previous presentations, that it is a very staff-intensive program. The staff go there every week, and this provides a huge kind of morale boost up for the participants. And I think Dr. Banerjee's colleague Esther Dufflo called it the X factor. So that's, I think, is a major reason for the success, whatever we have. The third is how it is implemented. If a program is not implemented well, even a best model would fail. So that is why we now hear about the science of implementation. I think in our opinion also in BRAC, we believe that the implementation is the most important part of any successful program. The fourth is the question of leadership commitment. The commitment to adhere to the model all through the life of the project. The fifth is the context, and through this the women gets an asset, creating a ladder, for example. But it all depends on the access to the market and the agricultural situation there. The sixth is the question of proper targeting. And targeting is critical, as you have seen, and you have to identify the right family to reap the best benefit out of that. Seventh is the question of ensuring participation of greater community in the village, particularly the elites in creating an enabling environment for the Ultrapoor to improve the situation. And research has shown the value of creating, for example, the poverty alleviation committees in the villages of Bangladesh. 8 is the question of graduation, and we talk a lot about it. And the current model that we have assumes that all the Ultrapoor graduates will be graduating to a microfinance program. But what about if there is no microfinance there? So where they will graduate to? I mean, this is one of the questions that is sort of we are trying to respond to. And finally, and perhaps very importantly, it is the learning culture of the implementing organization. The organization must constantly monitor progress and change strategies as new issues or problems arise. Challenges in implementing a program like TUP will be enormous, and we have to learn how to identify those challenges and take actions in order to address that. And finally, in summary, TUP is a model that we believe potentially can lift millions of people out of ultra-poverty. And that is through a well-defined ladder. Overall, poverty reduction cannot happen until these poor people, the poorest people, are attended to and gotten out of the ultra-poverty. And in our opinion, it is possible to end ultra-poverty. We have seen some indications of that through the presentation today. So what is next? We think that this needs to be replicated and multiplied in more and diverse settings, which will help its further refinement and benefit more and more of the poorest. We at BRAC remain committed to scaling it up to reach hundreds of thousands of more of the ultra-poor. And obviously, we cannot do it ourselves alone. So others, the governments, the NGOs, the donors, the academies will have to come forward to really together we can achieve this. This is certainly a most important and promising candidate for a post-2015 agenda. We need continued monitoring of it, not only through employing the RCTs, which are very important, of course, but perhaps also using more of the qualitative methods so that we understand what is going on with the program. We are sure that our friends at LSE, MIT, Yale, and others will continue their interest in this and help understand the program more, understand the situation of the ultra-poor more, and get them out of ultra-poverty. So thank you very much, and thanks for your patient listening.
Hi, everyone. So I think I'm the last one between everyone here and a pub. So I will speak as quickly as I can. Or I guess I shouldn't speed up the rate at which I speak. I should talk. I should just say less. So even though this was billed as a discussant, I was explicitly told to come and talk about some other results. So I'm going to do the tacky thing, but by description, in terms of what I was told to do this, and rather than actually discuss the papers that were just presented, I'm going to now tell you about my work. Although some of it is actually with Abhijit too. So, so I wanted to throw out 3 quick thoughts that were on my mind as listening to what people were talking about. First of all, made this comment. We heard Robin mention how you presented these results, and everyone was like, "Well, of course, you gave away all this money. What do you expect things to go up?" And I do think it would be very interesting to see in this space a kind of predictions market set up for these types of studies. Would be, and God knows what type of selection bias we would have, or the type of people who would actually play in this market. But it would be interesting to see that, because I think this is a common issue. But let me just say one thing, which is I think the surprise here is not the direction, right? It's the magnitude, because if you had asked people up front, give away all this stuff and will things go up, everyone would say yes. If instead you asked, give away all this stuff, and it'll actually show to be a cost-effective tool, then you're going to get, you would have gotten a mix. And I think there's when you get surprises. I can tell you that I was certainly, when I first got involved in these projects, that was, I wasn't doubtful of the direction, but I was, kind of wondering, okay, is this going to really prove to be a scalable, can you really make the scaling argument? Okay, so that's the first and second thought. The last thought, which is just reconciling some of these results and some of the results I'm going to show you with some work that we did in India, I think is something which is giving me pause. At the very least, it's giving me lots of back and forth note writing with Abhijit just in the last 15 minutes when we were talking about this very point. So we did this thing in India where we just had a representative sample in Uttar Pradesh and calculated the returns to cows and buffaloes in a very accounting style. There's no randomized trial here. We weren't we weren't giving people cows and measuring. It was more like an accounting exercise. Imagine you were in business school and someone said, I have this investment idea, and you said, well, really, what are the cash flows? And so that's basically what we walked through with these households, and walked through the buy price, the sell price, all the input cost, all the output revenues, and what would it look like as an actual enterprise. And the title of this paper is Continued Existence of Cows Disproves Central Tenets of Capitalism. Because we find negative returns on average. We find really huge negative returns on average if you include wages at market wages. Now, God knows how we calculate market. That's obviously that's a problem with labor at this type of market. So we then also take it to extreme and say, fine, let's assume wages are 0. The opportunity cost of time is nothing. Even then we get buffaloes to a small single-digit positive return, and cows are still negative in small and single-digit. So, 0 is included in the confidence interval for both of those. So that's basically what we have to do to get those numbers to look even remotely reasonable, is assume wages are at 0. But now, putting this in light with what we're about to see, I think there's need to figure out how to reconcile these kind of things. So if you have, you just saw results that said give people cows and consumption goes up. Well, the consumption came presumably from income, which means there was a positive return to this cow. So does that mean, we do have a high distribution in the study I was just mentioning in India. So does that mean that there's something about this program that is generating profitable cows and not the unprofitable ones? And so the one argument could be that yes, that is what you get with the monitoring and the training that goes along with this. That is one way of reconciling these types of results. Okay. Onto what I'm going to present. So why replicate? So we did this. We saw this once with Bangladesh and then twice with Bandhan, and then Ford and CGAP, as was mentioned earlier. Was very excited about these, said we want to replicate, but they said we want to replicate along with more randomized trials to do this. And so this is one of the mantras, one of the motivations behind the original creation of Innovations for Poverty Action was the idea that, look, people always pose the external validity question when they see a result from one place in one country in one point in time, and they say, well, what can we do with this? And there's 2 directions you can do that with that. You can take that as a criticism of any evaluation and say, you're right, what are we doing? We're wasting our time, we shouldn't do evaluations because how could you ever take this lesson and go elsewhere? Or the other is you can say, yeah, you're right, you shouldn't take it too far from any one place, but then we should just do it many, many times. Now, that doesn't mean infinite times. We shouldn't do an evaluation every single place. But we need to be somewhere between 1 and infinity and every time. And this was an effort, and one of the mantras of IPA is that we need to do something more than one and less than every time. And this was one of the poster children for starting that. So the idea, though, is to think about replication is not just increasing your sample size. I think that's a key thing not to think of it merely as. So it is about testing it out in different environments. Now, it's very hard to set up a replication in a place where your environmental context, you predict it not to work. Right? If we wanted to replicate deworming in order to see whether what contextual factors were relevant, we would not set up a test of deworming here in inner city London. Just to prove that, in fact, having an infestation of worms is a necessary conditional environmental state in which for this theory to work. So it's not as simple as just saying we're trying out in different contexts and we have some theory about when it's going to work and when it's not. The theories that we need to test are more about within the contexts, about the type of people it's going to work better for, or the types of additional components and access to markets and things of this nature that might vary within a particular setting. And so that's what we mean by kind of theory-led replication, is to have some more variety in those types of more subtle contextual factors. There's also, importance for the replication to be able to see with different implementing partners, for instance, that have different organizational cultures. Are we going to see similar results? That's a very hard thing when we get a different answer to be able to pinpoint what is it that's driving that difference. But just being able to see whether the results are robust to different organizational dynamics and organizational cultures is important from a policy perspective when we go into a new place, and giving us the confidence of what we need to do, what type of organizations we choose, for instance, to implement. And there is a key element too about persuasion. So one of the projects, which I'm not going to report here on yet, is in Yemen. The reason for doing it in Yemen was about taking this idea and working in the Middle East, in an Arab country. And it was very much pushed by, we were kind of pulled into it, to be perfectly blunt. The idea was that, look, if you want to have this type of program in the Middle East, you can't show people results from Peru and Bangladesh and have them really convinced that this is going to apply in our context and in our culture. And so we need ones from each of the regions around the world, where then policymakers from those regions of the world will feel more comfortable using those results to implement local policy. So that's one of the reasons for the broad variety. So we're at different points on the different studies. I lost the map. We had a map showing you. So the results, the different studies that we have going on right now are Ethiopia, Ghana, Honduras, Peru, Pakistan, and Yemen. Where we have randomized trials in each of those. Now, there's a core thing that is almost identical to what has already been described, so I'm not going to go there at all. But in Ghana is the one place. So here's the basic design that we have going in most of those locations, where there's just treatment and control communities that are assigned randomly, and then within treatment communities, we have treatment individuals as well as control individuals as well as the non-eligible. So this allows us to measure whether there are spillovers by comparing the control households in control communities to control households within treatment communities to see whether there's spillover within villages. But the core treatment control is exactly getting at the same basic question. Ghana was the last to start, and had the luxury then of taking some of the learnings from the other places and saying, okay, given what we've learned so far, what are some of the key questions we want to start trying to get at that get inside the box a little more to understand why this is working? And so in particular, we separated out two components. One is the access to savings. Is it the case that with access to a safe and zero transaction cost savings account, with a strong NGO motivating putting money into a savings account, but with no infusion of capital, that you could then help someone accumulate the necessary assets to buy that goat on their own? And then likewise, there's another treatment arm that says maybe all this other stuff isn't needed. It is just a capital constraint. So let's just give out goats. So we call that the goat drop group. So we just do goat drops. The dropping of the goat, not the goat drop. So this is the complicated description of the design. I won't go through it bit by bit. We don't have the results yet from Ghana because that was the last to start. So I'm just whetting your appetite for next year's Growth Week. So we have a long survey module that's very similar to everybody else. We're good. Just as you saw from the other sites, a mix of different assets that are very specific to the country. The asset selection is very important, and we think is actually the key to the one real unsuccessful site, which I'll talk about in a second. So here we go. Very, very simple results. So the India you've already seen. Pakistan, similar positive impacts as India. Honduras is the only site with negative impact on consumption. That includes zero. So just think of that as a zero. Zero change in consumption. Ethiopia is quite big. Actually, the biggest in terms of the magnitude of the impacts there. One thing that's interesting about Ethiopia, as a side note, is one difference in design with the other sites. In Ethiopia, everybody got the consumption support that was part of the treatment only in the BRAC and Bandan studies that you just heard about. Whereas in Ethiopia, this was built on top of a conditional cash transfer program, so everybody, treatment and control, was receiving the weekly transfers of cash. And so our evaluation is over and beyond that. And so that's really striking that we get this huge increase in consumption when we don't, then that component is actually not part of the evaluation. Food consumption, obviously, is a large proportion of consumption period, so we'd expect the results to be similar, and they are. The likelihood, just very simplistic measure of likelihood of being above the poverty line. So in India, this is way up. In Ethiopia, this is way up. In Pakistan, this is the confidence interval here includes 0. So this tells us there's something distributional going on, and that's we're still analyzing the data for Pakistan, that does not go up. So why did Honduras not work out? Well, the chickens got sick and died, basically. Not every one of them. They were also expensive to feed. It turned out to not be a good choice for the livelihood. So it goes to say that there's nothing really contextual about that, right? There is something about, you have to choose the livelihood well, and not all livelihoods are going to yield these types of returns. And so it's not, this is an important part of the process, is really thinking through how safe are these assets, what is the technical skills necessary to raise them, what are they going to be the access to markets to sell them, things of this nature. And we think that's what's going on. We're still analyzing the data with Honduras, but that is what is screaming out at us, is that these chickens just weren't profitable. If we did the same analysis we did in India for cows on chickens, we would have just this massive negative returns to chickens. And just as a counterexample, in Peru, we have guinea pigs as one of the main things that people did. They eat them in India. In Peru. They use them as pets too. We have this nice little. I remember seeing this cute little girl who was 9 years old and petting her guinea pig, and which was going to be eaten later. It helped. My family was there with me. We created a new term for this called petibalism. So you have number of guinea pigs sold is way up, and then this is the number of guinea pigs slaughtered. Also going way up, so this is good. These are the ones being eaten by the family, and these are the ones being sold for cash and then doing something else. So net income is way up. So this is just a very simplistic asset kind of analysis. The same way I referred to with the cows in India that we did, and the same way that the chickens did not work out well. Okay, so last slide. Main takeaway points I want to leave you with is the overall message here is that we like to think is happening, but this is where we're a little bit weak, all of us, is that we're basically saying this is a big push approach. The whole is bigger than sum of the parts. Whoops, that's supposed to say SUM, not SOME. The whole is bigger than, that really makes no sense as I wrote it. It's kind of obvious. The whole is bigger than sum of the parts. The whole is bigger than SUM of the parts. So it's, in that big push approach. But to really, one thing to notice with that is there's kind of two explanations that you can have for that. One is that there's complementary returns to different interventions, which is one story. Another story is that each individual failure is devastating, and so you have to solve all of them to solve any of them. Right? Those are two different messages in a sense. And we don't know the answer because we didn't piece apart component by component to really get at that inside the box in that way. And that's one of the things that we're hoping Ghana will come out of this. And we're also hoping that in the second wave of these types of studies, as we start seeing them replicate, because the basic proof of concept is there, that with other sites involved, we can start teasing out all these different components. So the early impacts are quite positive, but not 100% of the time. And obviously the question then asked is, well, when it's not working, why? Like I said, the one site that we see the unsatisfactory results, we think it is about the livelihood selection. That doesn't mean just get that right and everything's okay, because a lot of work goes into all the other pieces of making this work. But ultimately, what we're left with, as I see it, is a really exciting proof of concept, one that countries should feel comfortable that we've now seen a good set of very varied contexts in which it's working, but still a lot of questions that remain on the table. So a lot of good room for further learning about how to improve the model, which components are most useful, and frankly, still remains the basic question of comparing to cash. Right? This is a hot issue and an important issue. All of these studies that we're referring to are just comparing to control groups with nothing. We are trying to set a new wave up in Ghana, for instance, that will compare it to cash. If other sites are able to do this, this is, I think, a really obvious next phase to start thinking about, because that could blow away cost effectiveness if the issue really was more about capital constraints in the first place. Because all of the monitoring is very expensive. Those weekly visits do cost a lot of money. And if that really is not a necessary component, the weekly visits could be reduced to monthly or quarterly or never. That would allow the same program to reach a lot more people. So I'll close with that, and thank you very much.
Take a few questions now. We'll have about 10-15 minutes for questions. There should be roving mics somewhere. Yeah, there's one. So please raise your hand. There's one up there, please.
Hi, this is mainly for the people who've worked on the BRAC study. It was amazing to see your results, really positive indeed. I was wondering whether you've got any measure of the social effects of this intervention. From particularly what Robin showed today, it was seen that quite a few of the ultra-poor would have leapfrogged people in terms of economic position who, before the intervention, would have been slightly above the threshold for qualifying, and whether there's resentment on the part of them or indeed on the part of the middle class members who are now having people who just a few years before were classified as ultra poor now being at a similar economic status to them.
I think probably actually Mushtaque is in the best position to answer this, because one aspect that we didn't discuss in great detail is how BRAC took charge of organizing and mobilizing the community to make sure that the program didn't backfire. So do you want to say something about the village committees and their role?
Well, one of the initial problems we faced was that when the ultra-poor were given asset, for example, there was a risk that those might be stolen. And one of the response to that was that how do you really protect their assets, except that you can build a better place, for example, to keep the asset and the person will keep watch on that. But also we thought that why not also try to involve the community around, and because if somebody sort of steals it, it will be from the same community. So if you can build a support group within the community for these ultra poor, then the chances of those happening will be much less. So BRAC started talking to the local community, particularly the elite of the village, and we ended up in setting up what we call the village poverty alleviation committees, in which we had the ultra poor themselves, as well as members from different sort of socioeconomic groups. and they provided the security, for example. So that has worked quite well. It wasn't there at the beginning of the program because we didn't really foresee it. So that's another sort of example of why you need to really continuously monitor and study the program and try to address whatever we sort of come along the way.
First of all, thank you very much for your talks. My name is Marcus and I'm a starting student at the LSE. And my question is a bit related, concerns the effects of the program on the middle class. Was this actually, because we saw that there's a convergence indeed between the ultra-poor and the middle class, is it also a convergence in the sense that the middle class maybe has to pay higher wages for the ultra-poor and therefore has a lower income? Did you test that, and what are the results?
Yeah, so I guess to the former question, this question, we don't have a sort of we can look at life satisfaction, those sorts of things, but we don't ask them directly, are you depressed by the fact that you've been leapfrogged or whatever. I think the one effect which we can look at, and this paper doesn't really look at it, is, for example, what you're pointing to, which is wages. And broadly what happens is that as the people, the ultra-poor remove their labour from the agricultural labour and other itinerant wage markets, there's less people doing it, so the wage goes up, which would kind of go in the opposite direction. Now, of course, it's only the poor that work for wages. So if you're at the top of the distribution, not so much the middle, because you wouldn't be, you're not rich enough to employ others, but if you're at the top, you are going to be pissed off that the wage has gone up. So you're absolutely right. To look at the whole thing together, you would need to look at the effects across the distribution, which we're in the process of doing, but don't really have the clearest.
Just to add to that, one other effect on the middle class is on charity, and one of the things we find is that the poor report less help from, in fact, essentially wipes out all the help they get from other people. This program wipes out, and we find a small effect on their helping other people. So that's sort of a interesting other dimension where maybe the middle classes are also benefiting.
I was also going to just add, we do look at happiness, and so in Bandhan as well, and see these kind of very qualitative measures of happiness go up in India and Abhijit's work, and then in Honduras, oddly, interesting enough, we did find in the first wave happiness go up, and then came back down. Maybe because the chickens didn't work out so well. But what was actually even more interesting, I thought, was that the control group within the treatment areas, their happiness went down. And one argument there could be that that even though it was not so obvious to them that the chickens weren't working out so well, they just know that they were excluded from this free thing that other people were getting, and it made them a little bit sadder about their situation.
Hi, were these assets ever used for insuring the households against consumption shocks? Like, asset depletion is a very common strategy to smooth consumption.
I don't know empirically on the others, but I can say that theoretically this is one of the motivations for the consumption support bundles that were given. The idea, the logic in the design was that by giving the weekly bundles of rice and food and whatnot, that if there is a shock, until the asset starts producing income, there isn't a need to start selling or slaughter the asset in order to eat. And so that the weekly bundles of consumption are supposed to be helping exactly on that, so that once the asset is producing income, then the income can absorb the shocks. At least that's in theory one of the motivations for the consumption support. But others can speak to what they found.
Yeah, I think the fundamental change is that now you're spreading your labour and income across the whole year, whereas before, I think it's known as the sort of the Monga region, where much of what we were studying. So this is an area with chronic hunger, sort of almost famine area. And that's primarily these people who are entirely reliant on agricultural labor. And if the weather is bad, you're not going to be hired. And so in this case, you can then go back to putting more effort into your livestock asset and continue. So the livestock asset is less prone to weather shocks than crops. That's one, fact one. Fact two is that if you have one, rather than compared to you don't have one, you can go put your labor effort into the livestock asset and at least get some income. So it talks a bit to the insurance story.
And indeed, in Bangladesh, we find that income becomes a lot more stable and a lot less seasonal, thanks to the program.
Yeah, thanks. On the themes of scalability that you already picked up, and also the general equilibrium effects, I was just wondering, was there any sense that there's some sort of limit to, say, the number of cows you can buy for poor people in a certain area, where then the value of the asset drops, or there's so many chickens that eggs are not worth anything anymore, or anything of those kind of effect?
I would say these are the types of things that we saw across the sites everyone was thinking about as they chose the livelihood. It's one of the reasons why you don't see any sites where everybody got the same exact thing. Or when you see a dominant one, it's one that is a really intense market, and so the infusion of that, a little more of that asset, isn't actually moving markets. That is certainly one of the considerations that went into every site's selection of the asset.
Yeah, I think we're currently doing the price analysis of the price data. So, if you have, as you say, a glut of something, eggs or meat, but we're seeing relatively small effects. And presumably, when you start to get into that glut situation, you might move into something different. I think the other thing to sort of keep in mind in general about the overall, if you think, macro effect is that this may make a lot of sense for helping women in very poor communities who are unlikely to move. But the kind of overall development of Bangladesh will probably be more driven by people moving from these communities into. I'm not saying I don't have the data to prove that, but that would be my guess. So it's sort of helping them do better in these communities where they're likely to be rooted. They have children. They're not young. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. This is not some sort of silver bullet for all development.
There was, in the short run too, we would increase the price. So yeah. in northern Ghana, we did think that there was like a short run blip, because we went into the market, we'd go to the local markets and buy all the goats, and then turn around and bring them to the communities. So,
for what reason were these households not in microfinance programs such that they were able to participate in this one, these ones?
They were too poor. They just didn't know what to do with a small loan that they had to repay after a week.
Yeah, it's both a demand and supply situation, because in demand in the sense that, as Oriana was saying, that they're too poor, they know that they can't use the loan, and so. But also on the supply side, the loan officers, for example, wouldn't give a loan to those people because they know that they won't be able to repay it. So it works from both sides.
So I see the reason for targeting women, but if one were to take the approach from the point of view of the household and ask the question of who would be the ideal recipient, the optimal recipient of an asset if you were trying to get the whole household out of poverty, is there anything from your maybe future plans of research or existing results that would allow us to know whether the woman, the man, or a young maybe son or daughter would be the ideal recipient?
So obviously don't have the perfect answer to that question since we didn't try others. But I think one of the guiding theories of this exercise is that there is a fair amount of labor surplus in a certain set of families. The idea is that especially women who I think a lot of the households that I met a bunch of households, I think, because we are a very small sample, I think I met 10% of them or something. And very, very clear, I mean, most of them actually have an adult male in the family, or half of them or something, but almost none of those people are earning, because that was one of the criteria. So these are typically women with a husband who's either has been in an accident or has some chronic disease or is an alcoholic or something like that. So for those people, and they often have young children, the combination means that their ability to work outside is very constrained. So one of the things they were responding to was the fact that they would like to work, but they couldn't. Wage labor is difficult for someone who has young children plus. And we would ask them, what do you do with your children when you go out to work? And they say, the neighbors are kind, they take care of the children or something. But that's a huge issue for many of these people. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it made sense to target these women, because they actually probably had, part of the point of these assets is that they don't require a lot of going out. Most of the time what you're doing is, you're just tending to your cow, and then occasionally you go out to sell the products, but it's not so often. And most of the earnings we found came from selling and buying by selling the grown animal, not from milk. It's the irregular earnings from selling animals, which is the big earnings in all of this. So I think that's something that doesn't take a lot of time. So I think the time dimension of it is important in the design of the program.
In some of the other sites, it isn't targeted in the same way, too. And the intervention really is, I think, in some of the other sites, best described as a household-level intervention, not an individual one. So for some of the similar reasons. The slack in labor is not just one person. It's a little here, a little there, and if it's tending to an animal, then, it's moved around who's doing it.
Just one last question. Thank you.
Just wondering if any of the studies looked at the possibility that the diversification of the occupations that were chosen led to greater maybe informal lending across the villages, in the case that maybe some of the shocks that would have hit some of the occupations or livestock would have allowed some people to lend over in an informal way, or insurance.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something we looked at directly, but one of the co-authors, who was a PhD student who's now at Bocconi, he looked at basically how the insurance arrangements of these people change, because we were monitoring gifts, not just financial transactions, but also food, which are very important. And what he found is that initially you had more of a system whereby you borrowed from your landlord either food or money. So you kind of ran out of consumption, and then you went to your landlord and you got some food or money to keep you going until you got some more labor income. And basically with the advent of this program, whereby, as Abhijit is pointing out, in our case, you actually worked fewer hours per day. Your days of work, on average, for those days you worked, went down, but you spread that across the year. So total hours went up. And so in the case of the study the student did, they moved from doing that type of arrangement, where of course you're forward selling your labor probably at a below market wage, to doing much more what you're describing, which is to give and take to people who are closer to wealth than them. So they became, actually, as I was just pointing out, actually net, in some cases, net givers of transfers, which was helping others, presumably, to get through some shock. But it was quite striking that they broke off their sort of indenture to the landlords and moved to much more reciprocal type of insurance arrangements with people who are sort of more like peers in wealth terms.
Thank you. I think we ran out of time for tonight. And let me please thank the speakers and the discussants and some very special people who are Amelia, George, Jen, Celine and Jeanette, who helped a lot organizing all of Growth Week. Thank you everybody for coming. Good night.